we live on YouTube.
Great. So it's my pleasure to moderate the second panel of today's conference, Mother and Child. And I will straight go into the introduction of our first speaker of the panel. It's Małgorzata Radkiewicz, who is Associate Professor in History of Audiovisual Arts at the Jagiellonian University in Kraków in Poland. And Małgorzata authored a large number of articles, and she authored 6 books, I have to mention. She didn't ask me to mention all of the books, but I thought it was quite impressive, the number, on a wide variety of topics, among others, women directors and artists, in which she is addressing the issue of women's cinema and arts in terms of feminist theory. She authored a book on queer cinema and sexuality. And in her last book, she wrote about Polish female film critics of the 1920s to 1930s and worked with historical sources and original sources for this book project. Małgorzata also between 2015 and 2018 coordinated a larger research project on pioneering women in cinema and photography in the Polish Galicia between 1896 and 1945, so late 19th, early 20th century. I will post a link to her work that you also find in the conference program. And what is also worth mentioning is that her recent article on Maria Hirschwein, a Polish Jewish film producer from the 1930s, is going to be published soon in the journal Camera Obscura in this year, in 2021. And Małgorzata is also member of the board of the Museum of Photography in Kraków, and she is today going to talk to us about a new woman as a single mother in essays, popular literature and films in Poland of the 1930s. And we are very much looking forward to your talk, Małgorzata. The floor is yours.
Thank you, Birgit, for your introduction, and thank you to all organizers for making that event possible, although not in that way that we expected, but still very nice and interesting. So let me start with my presentation. Oh, this one. Yeah. I hope it's visible right now. I will talk about a new woman, a category that works very well while you want to analyze some essays, popular literature and film in Poland. And actually, Elisa Marie gave a wonderful introduction to my paper in previous panel. And as you would notice, there would be some issues that we both addressed in our presentations. So let me start. Oh, why is it? Oh, right now it's okay. So let me start with my paper. I'm going to speak about the mid-war period in Poland, when the term new woman, which had been already used in the previous century in opposition to the Victorian pattern on femininity, gained real meaning. In a modern world, educated and working women who favored their careers over family life became visible in the public sphere and entered it in various roles, from politician and activist to consumers of goods and popular culture, including cinema. And at the very first Women's Congress in Poland, which took place in 1907, Zofia Naukowska, a Polish writer and a feminist, argued about femininity in a wide discussion. And she claimed that women should get rid of the male glorification of femininity. She also rejected any sentimentalism in the women's movement. In her opinion, women should speak with their own voices, emphasizing that the political and social movements lacked at that time particularly what only women can say as a woman. She argued that women want not only equal political and social rights, but the right to their privacy, to their free bodies. As she wrote, it's not only about the citizens' rights and equality in law, not only equal upbringing and one morality for boys and girls, and elimination of marital dependence and preventing prostitution, freedom to make decision to work. It is also about the right to love. Putting love at the very first place of her list made a lot of arguments against her presentation, but after years, especially in the 20s and in the 30s, when many feminist activists branched out to broader social activism, some of these issues that Naukowska addressed in 1907 became especially important. They were raised, among others, by Irena Krzywicka, who was also a writer, a journalist, and an activist. Irena Krzywicka, both in her novels and her articles, argued that a woman needs to find herself. In order to achieve this, an open debate needs to be initiated on female sexuality, on taboos associated with the female body. And for Krzywicka, a modern woman needs to free herself from monogamous patriarchal limitation, family obligation, and sentimental education. In her works, Krzywicka promoted the idea of liberating the body from social conventions corresponding with the modernist suspicion of traditional values and social principles. She published her essay in a progressive weekly literary news, Wiadomości Literackie, clearly expressing her liberal ideas about both women's position in the society and criticizing the mystification of femininity, especially of women's bodies, menstruation. She was the first one, I think, in Poland who openly demanded 3 days of work during menstruation, emphasizing special conditions of women during that time about pregnancy, maternity. She advocated abortion law, being against the abortion forced underground, the right to freely use language about female sexuality and sex education for children, openly writing about social taboos. Krzywicka, moreover, had an open relationship with her husband Jerzy Krzywicki and did not conceal having an affair with Tadeusz Bojżeleński, only confirming the opinion of people who declared her morally corrupt. And that title, Morally Corrupt, appeared years later in a book about Irena Krzywicka, who was openly called morally corrupt. Tadeusz Bojżeleński is a very interesting figure, not only as a partner of Irena Krzywicka, but also as a doctor, a writer, and a famous visitor of a cabaret in Kraków, who asked him very often to write text for special performances. And in last panel, we discussed about these influences and transnational dimension of Polish law. And there was that idea about being inspired by French texts and discussions. And actually, Bojżeleński was a translator from French to Polish, mostly dramas and literature, but I think that he was familiar with publication of that time, so maybe that French connection would be important. In 1928, Boj published a text in Kurier Codzienny, Daily Messenger. The title of that text was Biedna prababka, Poor Great Grandmother. In that text, he started a campaign, one of many campaigns that he was leading, concerning social conventions and morality, which was sometimes referred to as the fight with ignorance. That text was followed by many others, also published in Kurier Codzienny, in that Daily Messenger. And in this text, Boj discussed the subject of marital law, which needed to be unified around the country, and the problem of divorces. He also explored the subject of the Planned Parenthood and the women's right to terminate a pregnancy. The writer put forward a vast range of arguments against the numerous family, a negative impact of the health of women, contribution to the impoverishment of the family, and indirectly to alcoholism, demoralization, and growth of the crime rate. Wojciech was especially involved in that movement again the anti-abortion bill that was finally announced in 1932, with punishment up to 5 years in prison, both for a woman and a person who performed an abortion. In that discussion on abortion, he found a partner, and Krzywicka also, in a person of Justyna Budzińska-Telicka, who was a doctor and also an activist. And in her writings at the beginning of the 1930s, she argued that when a woman does not want or cannot give birth, when she shrinks at the thought of giving birth to an unwanted child, once she was forced to give birth to against her will, a child whose arrival could bring a tragic fate to its mother, then this woman is a subject to the old-fashioned, unrealistic, and strict male legislation in our penal code that forces her to give birth, that demands forced maternity. A code that shouts in human voice, woman, you must give birth. And I tried to find precise numbers of these abortions. Unfortunately, I got only one source that was given an estimate number for the end of 20s and beginning of 30s. And it was said that the number is estimated around 300,000 abortions per year. And there were thousands of women who didn't survive the act of abortion, especially when it was done unprofessionally and not by doctors, but by just average persons. So putting all together, all these issues that were discussed in essays, in written forms, there were also very visible forms of expressing these ideas in everyday life. And one of these ideas about parenthood took a form of a clinic, and it was the first family planning clinic opened in Warsaw in October 1931. The whole idea came from Tadeusz Bojżeleński and Irena Krzywicka, but they were supported by many others, including Justyna Budzińska-Telicka. And I found numbers that during the very first year of that clinic being open, there were more than 4,000 women who came for advice and who were treated. So it shows that coming from theory to practice was not so complicated as we could expect it, but it was, of course, very tough, but it was very efficient act. And I used in my topic that term single mothers. And there were actually some data about being a single mother in mid-war Poland. And again, estimated numbers for the end of 20s and beginning of 30s says that there were 50 illegitimated children born in a year. And it was really, shocking to see that almost 75% of these illegitimated children died before reaching 1 year of age. And that data was followed by information, maybe Elisa Marie knows more about that there were the rising number of crimes against children, including children who were abandoned or even killed. So all these topics come as a subject of films, and they come to the cinema. And why is it so important to see cinema as an example of that modern discussion on femininity and motherhood. I will use some arguments about that need of a new representation of femininity and social issue from a text of Dorothy Richardson, who wrote not only about new women, or these women of the future, as she called them, but also about films and cinema. And one of her texts written in 1924 for Vanity Fair, she ironically noticed that's quite difficult, especially for men, to start thinking about the women of today as contrasted to the women of the past. She found that phenomena to be easily understood, especially when we consider how difficult it is, in her opinion, to think the feminine past, to escape the image that thronged the mind from centuries of masculine expressiveness on the eternal theme, expressiveness that has so rarely reached beyond the portrait of a woman, whether Madonna or Helena, in her moments of relationship to the world as it's known to men. Richardson was quite skeptical about gender models, admitting in her writings that although, quotation, battalions of women have become literated and masculine illusions are dying like flies, still, even today, most men are scarcely aware of the searchlight flung by these revelations across the past. These modern women, they say, are a new type. And such a new type of a woman who was active in the field of culture was Maria Morozowicz-Szczepkowska, who was an actress, who was a writer. She wrote few theater plays, outstanding theater plays of that time, and also screenplays. And I'm going to talk about one film that was directed by Juliusz Gardan. I will skip that slide. By Juliusz Gardan in 1933, based on a script by Maria Morozowicz-Szczepkowska with two actresses, Irena Eichlerówna as Krystyna, a lawyer, and Jadwiga Andrzejewska, Jadzia. As you see, that film was made under a working title, Kto winien, who is guilty. And actually that title much better addresses the issue that will be raised in that film than the official title, The Sentence of Life, which is actually more sentimental and more melodrama. The story, the main figure of that story is an emancipated lawyer, Krystyna, who in jail meets a young woman accused of killing her child. After knowing the story of Jadzia, of that young woman, Krystyna decides to defend Jadzia at the court that is going to put the highest sentence on that woman. And the story of Jadzia is quite simple. Jadzia comes from a poor family. She starts working in Warsaw and her life seems to change, but she meets a man, and after a short love affair, she gets pregnant. Again, she moves to the countryside, but she's alone. She's abandoned by everyone. Even the closest people are very unfriendly, and she stays completely alone, being pregnant and being lost. When the child is born, Jadzia decides to commit suicide. She goes by the river, but by an accident, before she jumps, the child drops to the river and dies. And of course, for that, after that accident, she's punished and she's like excluded from the community in a double way. Firstly, because she's a single mother. Secondly, because she's accused of killing her own child. But when the case appears in the court, Krystyna uses many arguments to ask that question, who is guilty, once again. And after that complicated case, Jadzia gets second chance, and she's asked to be resocialized by working. But that film was not completely strict to the script of Maria Morozowicz-Szepkowska, who was a very involved feminist. So there was that melodrama ending because Krystyna invites Jadzia to her house. And when Jadzia comes, it appears that her lover and father of that child was Krystyna's husband. So the man tries to commit suicide, but he survives, and Krystyna decides to stay by his side. Jadzia.
May I interrupt, Małgorzata? The time is over, unfortunately.
Yes, okay, it's almost the last slide.
Perfect, absolutely perfect.
So Jadzia is left alone. And Maria Morozowicz-Szepkowska, who was very involved in performing her plays, and she was really devastating by changing the end. But people liked that film, and it was listed one of the best films for the 1933. And just to conclude, I just want to show you that picture because in the previous presentation, Tadeusz Bojżeleński was also mentioned as the author of a collection of essays, Women's Hell. And that collection of essays was published in 1930. And here on the left-hand side, you could see Tadeusz Bojżeleński signing his book in the room of Wiadomości Literackie. And these two pictures on the right are taken during the women's strike and protest in Poland in autumn 2020. As you could see, Piekło kobiet, Women's Hell, was the leading slogan. So it shows two ways actually of perception of that period, mid-war period. On one hand, it could be depressing that 100 years later, we still have to discuss that women's hell. But on the other hand, we could see that the level of these argumentations and these discussions about motherhood, femininity, parenthood, which was taking place in the mid-war Poland, was a very professional and on high level. So we could still use these arguments in present situations. Thank you very much, and sorry for being a little bit long.
Perfect, perfect. Thank you so much for the great talk. I think a wonderful opening for this panel. And as in the last panel, we will straightforward continue with the second and the third talk and save the questions that are coming in now for the final integrated discussion. So I'm happy to introduce the second speaker. It's Katarina Richkova, Associate Professor on the Department of Sociology at Masaryk University in the Czech Republic. And Katarina is focusing in her research on gender, on sexuality, and the social organization of intimacy. And she published, among others, by a book by Cambridge University Press, a monograph on sexual liberation, socialist style, communist Czechoslovakia and the Science of Desire, 45 to 89, which won, very much worth mentioning, in 2019 the Barbara Held Prize for Best Book, and it received honorable mention for the 2019 Adele Clark Book Award. So congratulations to Katarina on this great award. She is now currently embarking on her next project, a new project researching healthy mothers and normal children as they were constructed by expertise in state-socialist East Central Europe. And as I read on the website, on the project website, the group is now about to come together and is starting in July in a project called Expert Turn, Expertise in Authoritarian Societies, the Human Sciences in the Socialist countries of East Central Europe. And the countries they are focusing are Poland, Hungary, Czechoslovakia, and East Germany, in order to find out how experts in human sciences shaped ideas about healthy motherhood and normal childhood. And today's presentation will be about, will stem from this recent interest of Katarina, and it will be about how to bring up healthy kids, changing the understanding of childcare in state-socialist Czechoslovakia. And the floor is yours.
Thank you, Birgit.
We are very much forward to this talk. Thank you.
Thank you for inviting me, and shout out to my team members who are in the audience and among the presenters. It's really exciting. We are about to begin in July, but before that happens, I will present something. We will move now to the 50s and 60s in Czechoslovakia. I will start sharing my screen and present. All right. Here we go. In this paper today, I will analyze the pivotal role that experts, in particular developmental psychologists, played in Czechoslovakia when they moved public discourse from collective care towards individualized maternal care. So we will be discussing the change that occurred in the 50s and early 60s in Czechoslovakia. I will use as method the sociology of expertise, and I'll be happy to talk more about it in the Q&A if people are interested, but here I will focus mostly on the substantive changes and how things occurred. So many important things happened right before socialism came along. Mostly reproductive behavior and employment trajectories of women changed. When we look back into the 1920s, we will see that Czechoslovak women were giving birth over a span of 2 or even more decades. And rarely at that point in time did they have a paid employment. But that changed with the advent of state socialism. And so 2 generations later, at the turn of the 50s and 60s, women were typically married very early, had their children shortly after their 20th birthday, and almost never gave birth after their 35th birthday. And they also, in increasing numbers, held a paid employment. Between 1950 and 1961, the share of female labor rose by 1/3. So that's a fairly substantive change. That, of course, was accompanied by slowly decreasing birth rate. It kept dropping during the 1950s, and that, of course, was further fueled by the legalization of abortion, which occurred in 1957. So abortion on demand for social reasons was legalized in Czechoslovakia in 1957. Such a situation called for explanation or even an intervention, as some thought. How to make women want more babies? Should they stay at home with their infants? Or should they keep being workers above all? In other words, how to reconcile the traditional maternal role of the woman with her new role of a paid laborer. At the turn of the 50s and 60s, the new State Population Commission started, which was mostly a demographic endeavor, meaning demographers were the main experts in this commission. And they, of course, noticed this conflict in women's roles by a series of surveys that were conducted at the turn of the 50s and 60s. Importantly, the experts in the State Population Commission acknowledged that young women between 20 and 25 years of age experienced that severe conflict and concluded, here I quote a chair of the State Population Commission, to see this rightful diagnosis as an attack against the professional equality of women and their liberation from a total dependency on the husband's earnings would be a misunderstanding. This chair and his co-workers in this commission insisted that women's employment is pretty much synonymous with equality. Invoking the official term for maternity leave, which in Czech is mateřská dovolená, literally meaning maternal vacation, these guys said that we should actually abolish that term vacation and move on to understanding this time that women spent with their infants as the production of productive forces, how very Marxist. These guys said, and here I quote, we shouldn't label pregnancy, childbirth, and raising a small child as vacation. It's no vacation, giving birth and having children. It's hard labor. We should recognize the time spent on child rearing as the production of productive forces, and thus as a socially important occupation, and offer the woman an adequate salary. So these were still ideas that had been known from socialist camps from the early times, but now we are talking state socialism, state commission in a socialist country. The State Population Commission highlighted the need to improve and enlarge the network of preschool institutionalized care that obviously, as in any other socialist country, emerged and was intensified in socialist times. At the beginning of the 60s, a new group of experts entered the field, developmental psychologists. In this book from 1963, Psychological Deprivation in Childhood, they published it, and they were, in working on this book, informed by the Western research on early development of children who spent long months in hospitals or were taken away from dysfunctional families. So children who essentially grew up without any parental intervention or care. Such children were having troubles forming ties with adults and did show little interest in other children and other people in general. They were withdrawn or aggressive, could not speak properly, and were unable to express complex thoughts, also suffered from more frequent and longer illnesses in comparison with children who grew up in families. These psychologists argued that the difference between these two groups, institutionalized children and children families, was that the institutionalized children were separated from their mothers way too early. The symptoms these children exhibited were coined psychological deprivation. In the future, these psychologists predicted, these children will not be able to distinguish between good and evil, which will get them in legal troubles. They will not develop abstract thinking and thus will suffer from learning problems, and they will be prone to various psychosomatic issues and immune deficiencies. So across the board problems await these children in their future lives. And while some cognitive problems may be fixed, the emotional deprivation could not be made up for. How did this discourse come to be? This 1963 book became a bestseller and was translated from Czech to multiple languages. However, this book was preceded by a long and largely invisible research which was conducted by researchers who were scattered both across physical space and across scholarly disciplines. One such research group existed already since 1948, which is the year when communists took over. And that group was in Prague in the Socio-Diagnostical Institute. And Matějček, who I will mention more, and who was one of the co-authors of the groundbreaking 63 book about psychological deprivation, Matějček worked with these people. Throughout the 50s, other researchers explored the situation of institutionalized children. For example, a female pediatrician who directed a group home for small kids. These authors, importantly, did not reject collective care as such, but rather sought ways how to improve it. In 1953, a study by a pediatrician Nedvědová was published, in which the author documented the pitiful state of medical care of children in nurseries. There were too few doctors, nurses did not have proper training, there was messy paperwork so they could not track the children and their development and potential issues. 3 years later, in 1956, a psychiatrist Kubička published his research of almost 120,000 Prague school children, and he was exploring the influence of the mother's employment on the psychological maladaptation of children. And he concluded that mother's employment caused worse adaptation in about 10 to 20% of children. So that's a fairly large number already in the mid-1950s. But again, nothing happened in reality. The female director of an infant home in Luhačovice, Maria Damborská, who is the author of the last paper here that I mentioned, analyzed the sickness rate in her children in her home and identified a vicious circle. Children who were ill more often were isolated from their peers for longer, and as a result, they were sad, and that resulted in more illness. So all in all, the situation in which isolation produces illness, not only isolation due to viruses, but also isolation from emotional ties. And here we go to our developmental psychologists Matějček, Koch, and Langmeier. The previous studies that I mentioned only found a limited audience. The first expert conference on institutional care and early development took place only in 1960 and 1961. Up until then, really only as scattered papers. And then the 63 saw the publishing of the book, Psychological Deprivation, and that term, psychická deprivace, became a household name mentioned in the media, published, of course, by the state. Why that happened? One reason could be that findings of developmental psychologists, and mainly the normative conclusions that followed, simply did not resonate before the first decade of building socialism was over. The sociologist Stephen Saxenberg argues that it was only in the 1960s when there was a discursive opening to criticize nurseries and support the extension of maternity leave. I would insist that the relaxed atmosphere of the 60s was important, but not the main or even sufficient condition for the discourse to change. Based on my research, I argue that the swift change in expert discourses that occurred in the early 60s was a result of linking of the previously scattered expertise. So the experts who were publishing in the 1950s came from different disciplines, psychology, pediatric medicine, and also from various institutions such as research institutes, children's hospitals, or infant homes. They just simply did not know each other or of each other. Expertise linked at conferences where experts could talk and discuss their findings. Once experts connected, expertise became more robust. And once the expertise entered the public sphere, it managed to resonate throughout society. The speed with which the expert opinion changed after expertise had linked is admirable. The bestseller, the 1963 book by Langmeier and Matějček, Psychological Deprivation in Childhood, was preceded in 1960, 3 years earlier, by a book, Psychology and Pedagogy of the Children, written by the tandem Matějček and Koch. So one author is the same, the other is different. In this book, the authors praised family for, quote, providing natural conditions for life. And because in comparison with the regular nurse, parents have a deeper emotional connection with the children, end quote. Institutional care was identified as bringing about artificial conditions that needed to be targeted and improved. However, the solutions in this book in 1960 were dramatically different from what these authors would recommend 3 years later. In 1960, they wrote, quote, the future institutional environment will not be a true copy of the domestic one because even the home is not the pinnacle of virtue. In the future, the institutional environment will take over all the virtues of the home and add to them the virtues of collective establishment. So quite a different understanding here. So during 3 short years, the discourse turned pretty much 180 degrees. In 1963, Koch published a book, Preschool Child and His Development, which presented the family as the only natural space for children, for young children especially. The idea that nurseries could take over some of the functions performed by the family all but vanished. The trope of psychological deprivation entered the vocabulary of ordinary people after the documentary Children Without Love was broadcast in 1963, the same year as the other book was published, by the Czechoslovak television. In it, Matějček, whom you see on the picture, one of the developmental psychologists, pointed to a paradox of what he called loneliness in the midst of the collective, end quote. The documentary Children Without Love juxtaposed images of children and families happily exploring the world around them, articulate and smiling in constant interaction with their mothers, with shots of hordes of children in infant homes who are constantly fighting, demanding contact with random adults, babbling monosyllabic words, or just absent-mindedly staring into the camera. Curiously, the term institution spread from designating infant homes or week-long nurseries when kids would be really 6 days a week, to cover even regular day nurseries. So everything now was an institution, which is potentially problematic. In an interview in this documentary film, a documentarian asks a headmistress in the nursery. So here you see the excerpts from the dialogue. So documentarian asks, well, it's clearly visible that despite all the care here, the children are emotionally impoverished, that even here we can talk about emotional deprivation, right? And headmistress answers, yes. Already at this age, some children exhibit symptoms of psychological deprivation. However, with most kids, it does not seem to be the case because they are physically fit and can do a lot, are independent and healthy and make a very good impression. But if you observe them more thoroughly, you can see that their emotional development has been disturbed. The discussion moved from infant homes to week-long and day nurseries, and as a result, experts perceived the danger of emotional deprivation in all children who ever left their family. Any separation of the child from the mother merged with emotional deprivation. While some contemporary authors might view discursive shifts surrounding early childcare as a humanizing trend in approaching children, it becomes clear that this improvement came at the expense of one group more than any other, women. As the writer Alena Wagnerová quipped years after socialism had ended, the woman question changed into the child question. And healthy kids were, from the early 1960s on, to be brought up at the expense of one group more than any other. Thank you. And here is the teaser for the new project and also my earlier book where some of this can be found. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much on behalf of the whole audience, Katarina, for this great talk and for taking us to the 1950s and 60s and spanning from the first talk, 1930s now, to the 1960s. I think this was really a bunch of two great talks that worked very well together. So let's hear the third talk of this first panel. I don't see any urgent notes in the chat, so let's move to the third talk and then we will have the integrated discussion at the end of the project. And thank you also for pointing us to your new research endeavor. So I'm happy to introduce the third speaker. It's Kamil Śmiechowski. Are you here? Yes. He's assistant professor in the institute at the Institute of History at the University of Łódź. His research interests are focused on urban history and the analysis of press discourse and processes of modernization in the 19th and 20th century Poland, and in the history of the city of Łódź. Recently, he concluded a postdoctoral research project on urban discourse in the Kingdom of Poland at the turn to the 20th century, which was supported by the National Science Center in Poland. And he has published, co-published in the book From Cotton and Smoke, which I'm going to post in the chat in a minute, with on industrial city and discourses of asynchronous modernity, late 19th to late 20th century. A book that examines local press debates and provides us with a broad portrait of 20th century urban experience beyond the metropolis in different historical contexts. And this research interest, this recent research interest of Kamil links up very closely with the topic of his talk, of today's talk, which is Industrial Worker as Mother, some remarks about the debate on the workers' motherhood in the local press of Łódź in the 20th century. And we are very much looking forward to your talk.
Thank you so much for your introduction of me. This is the second time that I can taking part in the conference of the Association of German and Polish History of Medicine, and I remember that the last conference in Hamburg was finished with a huge argument about abortion. And what was very funny there, the Polish members of the conference argued when the Germans was very quiet. So I think that it was very important, and it shows us that this topic that we are wanted to talk these days is still very important. And in my presentation, I would like to talk you about this problem of industrial city and motherhood in Łódź, which I think for the most of us is known as a city which flourished in the 19th century as a big hub of textile industry. And what is very characteristic for the textile industry, the number of women which are employed in the factories. In some branches of which they consisted the majority of workers. So in a result, we can say that living in Łódź forced obvious changes in relations between spouses and family life, and the model of family in Łódź was much more different than in Warsaw, Silesia, or other industrial centers. Under these circumstances, the motherhood in Łódź was much more challenging and whereas, and probably the most important problem for women in Łódź was that they had to do everything which was expected from mothers in the traditional society, even if their lifestyle was very modern. Another problem is a bad reputation of industrial cities, and of course, so they are the vanguard of modernity, but on the other hand, they are also the places where some problems like alcoholism, prostitution, street kids, poverty are seen very easily. And in conservative public opinion has a tendency to moral panic. And of course, which was considered in Poland as a both promised land and bad city. And this ambivalence is very important in understanding how the motherhood of workers was considered in the city. In the book that Birgit mentioned, we analyze discourse as a practice that shows us how do people experience modernity in the long 20th century. And under this understanding of the modern discourses, I would also I would try to show you some examples of very characteristical approaches to the workers' motherhood. But the general hypothesis is that all problems which were connected with those problems caused moral panic, which of course is style of discourse that caused fear among the audience. And maybe just information about three important stages of this of creation of this discourse. Before the Second World War, public opinion was generally very conservative, and it was believed that working in factories is dangerous for women. Of course, in the Polish case, the idea of Matka Polka was also very important. So the women were not only just women, but they also was Polish women, and they had to some Polish. They had to help to survive the nation during the partitions, of course. But also it was believed that in the ideal world, women should stay at homes, and workers' children were considered also as demoralized. Unwanted children and street kids caused moral panic. And at the same time, it was obvious that in city like Łódź, women have to work if they want to support their families, and education and medical system was underdeveloped and unable to ease social problems of the city. During the state communism, officially everything was very pro-women, but in the reality, which was also it was the place with many social problems, and the birth rate in which was the lowest in Poland. Political events that happened there during the communism also were different than in Gdańsk, for example, because they were less ideological and more economics. And probably the huge number of women which took part in, for instance, Hunger March in 1981 were completely misunderstood in the nationwide discourse. So, although the emancipation took place and the progress in development of labor law, nurseries, kindergarten schools was significant, the situation of the city was still very bad. And after the 1989, we can see an implosion of textile industry, which caused unemployment and poverty. Social problems are intensified. Anti-abortion law is also introduced in Poland in 1993. And in some fact, the public discourse is sacralized. So it becomes less rational and more influenced by the Catholic Church. Neoliberalism and individualism are new economic paradigms. And the traditional image of Matka Polka is also confronted with modern businesswoman, but there is no place for the female worker in this new reality. And let me show us some examples of which discourse about textile women and their motherhood. First is from the 1899. And we consider that the author of this article believes that women shouldn't work in factories. They just shouldn't work. And the situation where they have to do it caused many important problems. And it's also very bad that it happens. And in the ideal world, as I said, women shouldn't work in factories. But as I said before, in Łódź it was completely impossible. And in this situation, press had a tendency to create the moral panic. For instance, some of an author tell us that morality don't occupy the proper place in Łódź at all, but the female factory workers are the worst. They are the most demoralized part of the society. And of course, it's also very, very, very dangerous for their children, because they are, first of all, unwanted, and the second one, they are demoralized. Łódź was considered as the city of unwanted children, and what was very characteristic in Łódź, local press developed the construction of so-called manufacturers of angels. So there were women which was found by taking care for unwanted children, but in fact they were killing by them, or they were dying in 1 year after this. After being covered to these women. So it also caused very strong moral panic, and you know that writer of the press could think that this is the most tragic place over the world, because there is so huge number of children as unwanted. But of what is characteristic in the first decades of the 20th century, it's not connected with the any discussion about the reproductive rights. It's just considered as the another aspect of the fatal condition or moral condition of workers. And what is also very characteristic, it was believed that children which are which lived in a very set conditions, and of course they were very set in Łódź, are forced to be demoralized. And of course, even the number of schools was too small to help them, some problems, like some very modern problems, were seen. So in this quotation, you can see that for the author of this article, it was a very important problem that mother goes to work, and when she arrived, she didn't have a time to take over their children. So it was an important problem that wouldn't be so important if the women didn't have work in factories. But of course, in which it is impossible. So we should create some system of schools and nurseries which could help with this problem. But this system didn't exist, and at all. And during the interwar period, it was also a very, very underdeveloped. And what was also very important aspect of this discourse, it was believed that during the times of unemployment, it is almost obvious that textile workers are this group of population that became prostitutes, and as you can see, this is there are described as girls in this quotation. But on the other hand, of course, another problem was the problem of living conditions in the city, and children had to live in places which were similar to the dog kennels, as you can see in this quotation. So probably the Łódź was the worst place over the world. But of course, this discourse also enables authors to do some mobilization to solve these problems and to create some vision of the city in the future, which will be able to solve all these problems. And just jump into the 1990s, and what we can see there is the problems of Łódź in the local discourse are very similar that they were 100 years before. And in this long quotation, you can see that what the author says as that during the communism, of course, female workers were very important in the propaganda, but in the real life, for instance, Solidarność published some reports, and they said that the average female worker can sleep also 4 hours per day because she is so involved in children, in home, and also in work, which is very still very difficult for them to. And what is also very important, this this change in considering the textile workers and their living conditions happens in the time when this textile industry collapsed. And in this situation, women experience of Łódź is shown us in press like a fight between their the willingness to having a children and the reality. And this and here you can see that it is a story of a woman which was pregnant, and she decided to have the third children because during the economic reasons she wasn't able to give birth to the first 2 of them, and because she had to work in the night and to have money, and if she hadn't work in the night because she had the children, she wouldn't have enough money to live. So this was a very important problem. Another aspect of this new situation is the opinion about the city, that it is the city with the highest number of abortions. But just look that they are described there in the very vulgar way as schrobankas. So it seems that the reality is very changed, and the reproductive rights are planned to be reduced soon. So another problem with abortion was that after the code of medical ethics was changed in the first years after the collapse of the communism, the public hospitals de facto stopped doing this. And just look that the Gazeta Wyborcza informed that in November 1990s, just almost 500 employees of one of the biggest textile mill in Łódź signed a protest against this limitation of abortion law. And what was also very characteristic for Łódź discourse, the doctors from Łódź said that they will be doing it because of economic reasons, even if the law will be against them. And this is a very important feature of Łódź discourse. Some of the leading gynecologists from Łódź had very important problems because of his announcement that the abortions are still done because of economic problems of women, and which weren't able to feed the next child. And conclusion is that the problem of textile workers' motherhood was problematized in Łódź press discourse in different way than in national discourse. Problems characteristic for which were connected with unwanted children, bad living conditions, lack of hygiene, and all of them were very touchable, even for intelligentsia, who created the story about the city. In a result, the local discourse was less ideological and more compassionate. However, even in Łódź, the tendency to creating the moral panic is seen very easily. And the city was described as a bad city in the 1990s, and Polish Detroit, for instance, and also the place where everything collapsed, and the social situation is very, very sad. What should be stressed out after the 1989, the debates about the city become very, very similar to those from the first half of the 20th century. Being the textile worker and mother was still very difficult, and it seems that classical capitalism and neoliberalism were unable to recognize the subjectivity and specificity of the experience of motherhood of workers. In both realities, they became victims of conservative ideology, economic oppression, and poverty. And just look here, this is a Matka Polka monument, which is built in Łódź near to the biggest hospital. And the second picture is the protest in 2020, or not 2021, 2020, against the new limitation of abortion law in Poland. And just look at the traditional vision of motherhood, which is symbolized by Matka Polka, is empty. The monument stays in the middle of nothing. But in the second photo, you can see the very, very, very big crowd taking part in the biggest protest in Łódź after the collapse in communism, and they are fighting for the reproductive rights. So it shows that this experience of industrial city is quite unique in the Polish case, and it also could tell us something about the experience of modernity in the Central Eastern Europe at all. And this is everything for me till now, and thank you for your attention.
Thank you very much, Kamil, for this great presentation, and for opening up this third topic of modernity and urbanity to us in connection with motherhood and reproduction. Wonderful. So we have 25 minutes left for the general discussion and for the integrated discussion, and I have received already some questions. I will start to address them now in the order, and then we can open up to a larger discussion. So the first question was to Małgorzata and to Elisa Maria, and it was a question, if I remember right, from Katarina, and she was asking, are there really no information on numbers of abortions in Poland, and where did you find the figures? For Germany, the numbers were estimated from times to times. She references to the work of Cornelie Osborne, especially during the World War II period for political reasons. So Katarina, do you want to add anything on your question posted in the chat now after hearing all the three of the talks? Or
no, that's fine. I mean, I think Małgorzata already answered a little bit, and
I answered immediately, but I can add something. I just checked some data which were used in these publications on women's emancipation and on women's movement and on cultural life of Poland of that time. But probably there are numerous research, historical research, that go much deeper into this data. And in these books that I looked through, some articles by Dobrochnakova, but by Żarnowska, Aleksandra Żarnowska, who was mentioned in the last presentation, there were these estimated numbers. And I wonder actually to what extent you could give precise data if some of these abortions were illegal and that black market and that underground whole, system of abortion was working. So probably using these police reports or some of these documents, one could create like these precise number for each year. And I think that the second difficulty comes from that situation which was in a newborn country. Poland gained independence in 1918, and a lot of effort was put into consolidating these three parts, united once again. So probably the health system and also administration was a little bit different in Prussia, in former Galicia, for example, and that could be also making difficulties in collecting this data. Yeah, thank you.
Yeah. May I maybe follow up on what you just said with a very small question? Was it also, I mean, I remember from the work of Cornelie Osborne and others that the high abortion rates in the Weimar Republic that were said to be in some years equal to the birth rates in the Republic, so a very high number. And they were considered as a symptom of crisis of the Republic. So following up on what you just added on the new nation, the young nation, so how much was abortion numbers? How much were they connected in the public discourse? Maybe also in film, in the movies of this time to the feeling of a crisis or to national how could I say, to nation building processes? Was there a similar relation drawn by people in the 1920s in Poland, that like a link? Was there a link?
That issue of abortion wasn't so often addressed in cinema. There was much more about single mothers and dealing with that duty, which is connected with having a child. And a lot of these films were also about like a kind of sisterhood, of how women could be supportive to each other. And if there was no man who who could take that responsibility of a child. There were always female friends supporting. So there was a lot of pictures of that situation where children are really needed. So as you say, that connection between birth and abortion and crisis, it came together in these melodramatic stories about how is it difficult to survive. So the question of abortion was somehow hidden in these narrations.
Mm-hmm. Interesting.
But I thank you, Bartosz Ogórek, for being ready to provide us with data on abortion in Poland tomorrow during his presentation. So we are looking forward to that. Thank you.
Oh yes, thank you. Thank you also from us. Great. Tomorrow's panel 8 on abortion cultures. So let me pose the second question from the chat to Katarina. The critique of infant homes, etc., on the ground of findings of developmental appears to be an international movement. Do you know of institutions or networks of transnational exchange? And I had a similar question noted. As a historian of science, I was super interested in where the scientific ideas and influences came from. I saw some, I would say, German names as co-authors on the publications. And so, yeah, Katarina.
I briefly mentioned that the Czech authors were inspired by what the condition called hospitalism, and was from Western literature, the condition of children who were hospitalized, meaning separated from their families for longer times, and that was the kind of input for their studies. And the name Langmeier, albeit German, is the name of a Czech guy. So he was not a German himself, German, he was a Czechoslovak citizen. But it is absolutely true that, especially in the 50s, Czechoslovak medical doctors and psychologists spoke German, because obviously then it was the lingua franca of science. So there are, in my previous study, I mostly focused on sexologists, and those guys spoke German and were in touch with German literature. And of course, also English, which grew over time in numbers. And that goes to defy one of the typical expectations of people, that the Iron Curtain means that people in the East were detached from the developments in the West. And while we don't have the early connections mapped out so well, and we will definitely work on that in our project, we definitely mapped out connections in the turn of the 60s and 70s. And for example, on case of the introduction of sexual education in schools, Natalia Jarská, who is present here, Gábor Szegedi for Hungary, and I co-wrote a paper on how transnational influences actually triggered the introduction of sex education into schools in the early 70s. So there definitely were transnational movements, and clearly also in the earlier periods, and we just need to know more about how that shaped. And again, shout out to our expert turn.
Thank you very much. Okay, to give people time to I'm looking to the audience. I have many other questions, so I will go first and wait for our questions to come. Maybe to continue with this topic, Katarina, why in 63? I mean, is there also some political reasons? Are we on the way in 63, if I might remember right, towards liberalization, political liberalization, the first steps towards the Prague Spring? And is there also, what is the political situation?
Something, but I don't actually really think so, because I would go towards really focusing clearly on time. And as I said, the conferences which were pivotal in this particular change that I discussed occurred in 1960 and 1961. And that is way too early for the reformist movement of the Prague Spring, which was more like 64, 65, up until 68. What happened as part of the Prague Spring reform movement, which is pertinent to our discussion here, is the rethinking of family benefits and maternal leave. That occurred as part of the economical considerations, which are not so well known as are the reforms towards marketization of socialist non-market. But the economists who were part of the Prague Spring reforms actually realized a very funny thing, that the socialist system of family benefits was not socialist, because it privileged people who made more money, in that before benefits were introduced as a result of these reform movements, there were tax deductions in Czechoslovakia during socialism that privileged the higher earners more, because the deductions then were higher. So that was a very non-socialist thing. And also these deductions privileged the first child, but not subsequent children, which is non-pronatalist. So that these economists, as they were reformulating the economic background in Czechoslovakia, they realized, oh, this doesn't make any sense from any perspective that is pertinent to what we are doing here in a socialist country. So they suggested that there are family bonuses introduced, and the extension of maternity leave was also part and parcel of these changes, because that was also connected to the demographers I mentioned in the State Population Commission, who conducted the research at the turn of the 50s, 60s, asking women about their real lives, and women told them loud and clear that they are exhausted, that they need longer time out of work. So the maternal vacation, as it kept being called, kept getting extended and extended and extended. But the first socialist extension occurred only in 1968. And then in the early 70s, it was extended even further, and the bonuses and the support for the newlyweds, which had been formulated during the Prague Spring reforms, came to light. So that's the Prague Spring important intervention. But the other changes to the psychological discourse occurred a bit earlier.
The expertise formed a little bit earlier than your kind of expertise. Interesting. So Max Gavlich has a follow-up question on this topic, I think. Max, it's your turn.
Yeah, thank you. On the developments regarding developmental psychology and the adoption of Western research during the 50s and early 60s in the GDR. Trials to adopt this research were politically cut down, and in particular, the name of I forgot her forename. Schmidt-Kolmer is the head of children's research in the GDR, and she adopted early on hospitalism research and tried to adapt it into a socialist framework, which is still open for collective daycare, for example. And but she also registered very much the problems in weak care, and in particular in infant homes, and so it's a comparable situation. But in the bureaucracy in particular, I don't know who in particular, but state bureaucracy undercut this research, and names like Spitz and Bowlby were furthermore forbidden in the GDR. So how is there a comparable reaction from the political actors in Czechoslovakia, or is there no interest in this regard?
Oh, there is a lot of interest, I think. Exactly, the subsequent changes that were introduced actually attest to the interest that the state authorities paid to this. And what is interesting is to note that if you look at the number of daycare that was institutional, those numbers of children that could be placed, those numbers grew over time. So it's not that there was displaced, but the discourse was very strong in that maternal care was reposited as the only proper care. So the women were recast as mothers, but they never stopped being workers. And it was fairly clear that the daycare centers, kindergartens, nurseries need to be built, and were built. But there was a huge discussion in the 60s surrounding this one that I mentioned, also about how economically viable that is. If it's really good for the woman to, put her child to the nurseries instead of being at home with him or her with a child, because that's maybe economically expensive for the state to run the institutional care. So there were these discussions, but it did not affect the number of daycare centers built. But what it did affect is the discourse around mothers and maternal care, and the provisions that were designed for the family, including the maternal leave, the vacation, the length of which extended.
Thank you. A question for Kamil from the chat. Kamil, you made up for a long durée, asks Fritz, which at the same time let me wonder how tradition and historical experience has been and still is pointed in the discourse.
So thanks for this question. Of course, it's different if we are talking about the Łódź discourse and if you are talking about the nationwide discourse in Poland. But in Łódź, I think that the historical experience of women is now very important for people in their 30s. The younger generation of the middle classes, intelligentsia, how we can say, about this group, and for them it is very important that their grandmothers were textile workers, for instance. Probably the situation in Łódź is one more time completely different than the situation in Poland, because I think that the problem with motherhood is also very much more understood by public opinion. It's also another problem, and it's worth to add here that the city has a very, very big problems with demographics, and the number of inhabitants of Łódź decreased from 8 to 600,000 of people during the last 30 years. And this is not economics, but the small number of children during the communism, which caused this process. And probably the right could use this argument to create some anti-abortion and pro-natalist ideology, but in which it is completely helpless for them.
Thank you. Now there's a question from the questions and answers section that I'm happy to receive. So it's a question from Natalia Jaska, asking to Katarina, what about fathers? Were they completely absent from the pedagogical discourse of the early 60s? When did fatherhood begin to be discussed in the Czechoslovak pedagogy? Thank you.
Thank you, Natalia, for your question. The fathers were not really discussed, I would say, ever, because knowing what I do about, for example, Hungary in late socialism, or even East Germany, I would just say that the discourse on fatherhood was not really there in any meaningful way, by which I'm not saying that nobody ever said the word fathers, but just to connect fathers with especially early childcare, that was not a Czechoslovak thing to do. So in the late socialism, the marriage manuals were insisting that exactly the roles of mothers and fathers are different, in that fathers do not tend to younger children than adolescents, and in that only to adolescent boys, in order to like teach them the man's role and do men's things with adolescent boys. But fathers were not perceived as those who would be really interacting with children in any meaningful way. So that was the discourse that definitely got to people. And we can look more into, were they present in maybe some fringe discourse in pedagogy or psychology, how exactly that worked? That is a question to be answered. But in the audible public discourse, fathers were rather absent.
How about in your cases, Kamil and Małgorzata, in film and in
actually, I had additional slide about these figures of missing fathers. Actually, there are no there are fathers, biological fathers, but there are no fathers like in social terms or in terms of partnership. And I looked through these films, and these fathers sometimes, these missing fathers sometimes come back. There are these weak figures of men who commit suicide or try to commit suicide or escape. But I found two examples of films that create that figure of a father who is very kind, very gentle, and takes care willingly of the child, but these are not figures of biological fathers. These two films are comedies about men who are by a chance forced to take care of a child. So these were very good examples of how men could learn or use some skills that they've already had to raise a child, to take care of a child. But these two films were in form of a comedy, which gives a kind of, a distance, a bit of humor. So on one hand, it was not taken so seriously, but on the other hand, maybe there was searching for a way how to talk about that father figure in different discourse from that. There was mentioned that figure of Polish mother Pole, Matka Polka, but there is also that Polish father who is a fighter or a man who's got the mission, and that mission is not connected to family life directly. It's more connected to the country, to the nation, not to the child. So these two comedies were a good example of these ways how to approach that issue. Thank you.
Thank you. Kamil, do you want to add anything on the press perspective?
I think that everything that was said about the Matka Polka was also very significant in the tradition of Polish conservative society. But during the communism, it was also very idealized. I shown you the monument of Matka Polka in Łódź and the hospital named after Matka Polka, because it was built in the very last years of communism in Poland. And I think that the Jaruzelski regime was a little funny, because they were very communist and very conservative at the same time. So they used the motif of Matka Polka to create some new values about the nation, which was very important because the nation was in fear after the martial law. I think that something like the Ojciec Polak, it doesn't exist, and the Polish model of fatherhood is completely useless in the discursive way and in the symbolic way as well. I have a question from Joanna in the chat, and let me answer it. So if you look to the statistical data, you can see that the number of people who are moving from Łódź for Warsaw and other cities is smaller than the number of people who are moving to Łódź to study and stay in the city. So, of course, people from Łódź who did big careers in Warsaw are very easily to find, and maybe because of that, there is some opinion in Poland that all people from Łódź are working in Warsaw, but it's not true. The real the thing that caused that very big degrees of the number of inhabitants is just demographics.
Great, thank you for answering this question on migration that I think is crucial for the discussion in more general about reproduction. And
may I add something?
Yes.
Sorry, Birgit, to jump into the middle of
maybe 30 seconds left.
Okay, because I'm also living in a city that is now smaller in terms of population than 30 years ago, and we also have universities, and there are also people coming to us to study, but they are leaving then. So are they staying in Łódź? They graduate and they stay there?
Most of them, yes. Because for the people in their 20s, it's not completely not a problem to find a job in Łódź. But if you want to find a good job, you want to be a manager, for instance, you probably have to go to Warsaw or Kraków. And I think that the situation of Szczecin and Berlin is very similar to the situation of Łódź and Warsaw, but on the other, but we also had the additional problem with demographics.
Mm-hmm. Thank you very much. We're at the end of the time. Let's take this question to the next discussions that we will have today and tomorrow of migration. And I'm handing now over to Joanna, who will tell us what the next steps are. Thank you to the three speakers again of panel 2. It was a great panel. Thank you.
Thanks.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you, Birgit. Thank you very much. Yes, I fully agree with your assessment of the conference so far. So excellent. Great papers, great discussions. Let's keep up the excellent job, everyone. So what happens next is a break, a long one for all of us to sort of vent out and take some meal and recuperate and gather strength and energy for the next session. And the next session is going to start at 1:30. And we're going to go into the panel that is titled Public Health and Public Discourse in the Interwar Period. I will moderate that panel. We are going to have 2 presentations about journals addressed to general public and focusing on the problems related to motherhood, being women. One journal coming from Austria, the other one coming from Poland. It's going to be a great session. I'm very much looking forward to moderating it. But for us to have a very good experience in this session, we need a break. We need to take some rest. So let's have some rest and let's see each other at 1:30 sharp.
I think it's 2:30. Just to avoid any confusion.
Yeah. And now I confused everyone because I have 2 different timetables. Sorry,
we had
guys.
So many.
yeah. So let me reiterate. We see each other at 2:30. 14:30. Right.
That sounds great. Thank you.
Okay. Thank you, Birgit.